The morning rush at Denver International Airport buzzed with the usual chaos of travelers dragging suitcases and checking phones. Security checkpoint Delta 7 processed hundreds of passengers every hour, but what happened next would shut down an entire terminal. A woman in casual clothes approached the metal detector, her boarding pass ready. Within minutes, she would be surrounded by 6 security officers, banned from her flight, and facing criminal charges. But they had no idea who they were really dealing with. Sometimes the most dangerous mistake is assuming you know who has the power. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The early morning light filtered through the massive windows of Denver International Airport as Detective Maria Santos walked through the main terminal. Her sneakers squeaked softly against the polished floor, and her worn leather jacket hung loosely over faded jeans. In her backpack, beside her laptop and change of clothes, lay credentials that could command federal resources across 3 states. But to anyone watching, she looked like just another tired traveler heading home after a long weekend. Maria had been undercover for 18 months, infiltrating drug networks that stretched from the Mexican border to the Canadian provinces. The operation had consumed her life, requiring her to live in rundown motels, drive beat-up cars, and dress like someone barely scraping by. Today marked her first time in an airport as herself in over a year, though she still dressed down out of habit. At security checkpoint Delta 7, Officer Kevin Hartwell adjusted his badge and scanned the growing line of passengers. 23 years old with barely 8 months on the job, Kevin took his position seriously, too seriously, according to some of his colleagues. He believed every suspicious behavior could hide a threat. Every unusual passenger deserved extra scrutiny. His supervisor had already spoken to him twice about being overzealous, but Kevin saw it as dedication to protecting American travelers. Behind him, Senior Officer Patricia McMahon processed boarding passes with mechanical efficiency. 15 years of airport security had taught her to spot trouble before it reached the metal detectors. She prided herself on reading people, on knowing who belonged in first-class lines and who might be trying to scam the system. Her success rate for catching fraudulent documents was among the highest in the terminal. Maria approached the document check station, pulling out her driver's license and boarding pass. The license showed her real name, real address, but the woman in the photo looked different from the one standing before them. 18 months of undercover work had changed her appearance significantly. Her hair was shorter now, streaked with premature gray from stress. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and she'd lost 20 pounds from irregular eating and constant movement. Patricia McMahon looked up from her computer screen, her eyes immediately narrowing as she studied Maria's identification. The address showed an upscale neighborhood in Arlington, Virginia, but the woman before her wore clothes that belonged in a discount store. Her jeans had a small tear near the knee, her jacket showed wear at the elbows, and her backpack looked like it had seen better decades. The boarding pass indicated seat 3A in business class on United Flight 1247 to Washington Reagan National. Patricia's frown deepened. The reservation was paid for with a government travel card, showing a total cost of nearly $2,000. Nothing about this woman suggested she could afford such luxury, and nothing about her appearance matched the professional headshot typically associated with government travel. Kevin Hartwell stepped closer, his hand instinctively moving toward his radio. He'd been trained to watch for inconsistencies, and this passenger raised multiple red flags. Her identification photo showed someone polished and professional, while the person standing before them looked like she'd been sleeping in bus stations. The expensive ticket, paired with her shabby appearance, created exactly the kind of mismatch that training videos warned about. Behind Maria, the security line continued to grow. Business travelers checked their watches impatiently while families corralled children and elderly passengers shuffled forward with walkers. The morning rush was building toward its peak, and any delay at the document station would ripple backward through hundreds of people. Patricia held the license up to the light, examining the security features with exaggerated care. Her voice carried just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear when she spoke. "This photo doesn't look like you, miss, and this address doesn't match your appearance." Maria's jaw tightened slightly, but her voice remained calm. "I've been working out of state for an extended assignment. People change their appearance over time." Kevin moved to Patricia's side, his young face serious with self-importance. "An extended assignment? What kind of work keeps someone away for so long that they look like a completely different person?" The question hung in the air between them, drawing attention from passengers in adjacent lines. A businessman in an expensive suit craned his neck to watch the developing situation. A family with small children paused their conversation to stare. The everyday rhythm of airport security was shifting into something more dramatic. Maria understood the position she was in. Her cover story for the past 18 months had required her to become someone else entirely, someone who would blend into the criminal underworld she'd been investigating. Returning to normal life meant shedding that persona, but the transition left her caught between two identities. She looked like someone who didn't belong in business class, didn't belong with government credentials, didn't belong in the world her real life inhabited. The truth was classified at levels these security officers could never access. The operation she'd just completed would result in the arrest of over 40 individuals involved in trafficking operations across 7 states. Drug seizures worth millions of dollars would happen within the next 72 hours. But explaining any of that would compromise ongoing investigations and endanger other undercover agents still in the field. Patricia McMahon typed something into her computer screen, her fingers clicking against the keys with sharp, deliberate strikes. The screen displayed Maria's travel history, showing months of no airline activity followed by this single expensive government booking. Everything about the pattern suggested either fraud or something suspicious enough to warrant investigation. Kevin Hartwell's radio crackled to life with routine security chatter, but he lowered the volume and leaned toward Patricia. "This doesn't add up. Look at her clothes, look at that backpack. Nothing about her says government business class." A woman in line behind Maria shifted her purse nervously and whispered to her companion about the delay. Further back, a man pulled out his phone and began recording, though from his distance he could only capture the general tension of the situation. The security checkpoint, normally a place of routine processing, was transforming into a stage where assumptions about class, appearance, and belonging would soon collide with hidden realities. Patricia handed the license back to Maria, but her expression remained skeptical. "I'm going to need additional verification of your identity and the purpose of your travel. This ticket shows government funding, but I don't see any official documentation to support that." Maria's hand moved unconsciously toward her jacket pocket, where her credentials waited. But pulling them out here, in front of growing crowds and phones, would create exactly the kind of public exposure her department worked to avoid. Federal agents, especially those involved in undercover operations, were trained to maintain low profiles, even during routine travel. The irony wasn't lost on her. After 18 months of pretending to be someone else, of living in the shadows and building false identities, she was now being challenged for looking too much like the cover she'd finally shed. The woman she'd become during her assignment was someone who would never be questioned at a security checkpoint, because that woman would never have been able to afford the ticket that her real identity required. Kevin stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority he believed his uniform granted him. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to step aside for additional screening. Something about this situation doesn't seem right."
The words marked a turning point. What had begun as routine document verification was escalating into something more serious. Around them, the busy airport continued its normal flow, but at checkpoint Delta 7, a confrontation was building that would soon draw attention far beyond the security line. Maria looked at the two officers, at the growing crowd of curious passengers, at the phones beginning to point in her direction. She had a choice to make, and whatever she decided in the next few moments would determine whether this remained a simple misunderstanding or became something much larger. Maria stepped to the side as Kevin Hartwell gestured toward a metal table positioned away from the main security flow. The secondary screening area was designed for situations exactly like this, where passengers required additional verification, where their belongings needed closer examination. But being directed there carried an implicit assumption of guilt that every traveler understood. Patricia McMahon followed them, carrying Maria's identification and boarding pass like evidence in a criminal case. Her 15 years of experience had taught her to trust her instincts, and everything about this passenger triggered warning signals. The expensive government ticket, the mismatched appearance, the vague explanation about extended work assignments, all of it pointed toward fraud or deception. A Transportation Security Administration supervisor named Robert Chen noticed the commotion from his position near the metal detectors. 34 years old with a master's degree in criminal justice, Robert had worked his way up through the TSA hierarchy by maintaining order and supporting his officers' decisions. When Patricia caught his eye and nodded toward the secondary screening area, he understood immediately that they had a potential problem passenger. Kevin opened a thick binder containing protocols for document verification and passenger challenges. His training had covered numerous scenarios involving fraudulent identification, stolen credit cards, and passengers attempting to travel under false pretenses. Everything he'd learned suggested that legitimate government travelers carried additional documentation, official letters or credentials that supported their expensive bookings. Other passengers in the security line began to slow their pace, curiosity overcoming their desire to reach their gates quickly. A college student recording a social media video panned her phone camera toward the secondary screening area. An elderly couple whispered to each other about the young woman being detained. The routine flow of morning travelers was becoming an audience for whatever drama was unfolding. Maria placed her backpack on the metal table and unzipped the main compartment. Inside were the ordinary belongings of someone who'd been traveling for weeks. Worn paperback novels, travel-sized toiletries, energy bars, a charging cable tangled around a portable battery pack. Nothing suggested the resources or lifestyle that a $2,000 business class ticket would typically represent. Patricia lifted each item from the backpack with deliberate care, examining everything as if searching for contraband or evidence of deception. A small notebook containing what appeared to be random phone numbers and addresses drew her particular attention. The handwriting was messy, urgent, exactly what someone might use to track criminal contacts or coordinate illegal activities.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The notebook was actually Maria's record of witness statements and suspect movements from her undercover operation. Names, addresses, and phone numbers of drug dealers, money launderers, and trafficking coordinators filled every page. But without context, it looks suspicious enough to support Patricia's growing conviction that this passenger was involved in something illegal. Kevin stepped closer, his voice carrying the authority he believed his position granted him. "Ma'am, can you explain why you're carrying what appears to be surveillance notes? These phone numbers and addresses suggest activities that might be inconsistent with legitimate government travel." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was just beginning to spread. Around them, more passengers slowed their movement through security, sensing that something significant was happening. A businessman held up his phone to record the interaction. A family with teenagers gathered closer, their conversation dropping to whispers as they watched the unfolding confrontation. Maria's training had prepared her for situations where her cover might be blown, where criminal contacts might discover her true identity, where split-second decisions could mean life or death. But nothing in her federal law enforcement experience had prepared her for being challenged by airport security officers who refused to believe she belonged in the business class seat she legitimately purchased. The irony cut deep. For 18 months, she'd lived as someone else, someone who would never be questioned about her right to occupy any space, because that person would never have access to those spaces. The criminal persona she'd developed was someone who flew economy when she flew at all, who stayed in budget motels, who dressed and acted like she had no authority over anything. Now, attempting to return to her real life, she was being judged by the very appearance that had kept her alive in the underworld. Robert Chan approached the table, his supervisor credentials giving him authority to escalate or resolve the situation. He'd seen thousands of passengers pass through his checkpoint, and experience had taught him to recognize the behavioral patterns of people attempting to deceive security systems. Everything about this woman's demeanor suggested someone hiding something significant. Patricia handed him the notebook, opening it to a page filled with addresses from cities across 3 states. "Look at this, Robert. Phoenix, El Paso, San Antonio, Denver. These aren't random travel notes. This looks like someone tracking movements across the Southwest Corridor. Combined with the identity discrepancy and the expensive government ticket, we might be looking at something much more serious than document fraud." The geographical pattern was actually Maria's case map, tracking the movement of drugs and money through a network that stretched from the Mexican border to major distribution centers in the American Southwest. Every address represented a location where she'd gathered evidence, conducted surveillance, or witnessed criminal activity. But presented without context to airport security officers, it created a narrative that painted her as the criminal rather than the agent investigating the crimes. More phones appeared among the watching passengers. A teenage girl started a live stream on her social media account, whispering commentary about the suspicious woman being detained at airport security. The viewer count began climbing as her followers shared the stream with their own networks. Within minutes, hundreds of people were watching the confrontation unfold in real time. Kevin picked up Maria's driver's license again, comparing the professional headshot to the woman standing before them. The transformation was dramatic enough to suggest either significant life changes or deliberate deception. His training had taught him that people involved in criminal activities often altered their appearance to avoid detection, and the contrast between the identification photo and current reality supported that theory. Maria's flight departure time was approaching, and she could see the gate information on monitors throughout the terminal. United Flight 1247 to Washington Reagan National would begin boarding in less than 40 minutes. Missing the flight would mean missing critical debriefings with federal prosecutors and potentially delaying arrests that had been months in planning. But explaining the urgency would require revealing details about ongoing operations that were classified far above the security clearance of anyone in this airport. Robert Chen pulled out his radio and switched to a secure channel used for communicating with federal agencies. "We have a passenger at checkpoint Delta 7 whose documentation and behavior suggest possible involvement in interstate criminal activity. The travel pattern, notebook contents, and identity discrepancy warrant federal investigation." The radio crackled with static before a voice responded from the airport's Federal Liaison Office. "Copy that, Delta 7. We're dispatching an agent to your location for a passenger interview. Maintain custody until federal personnel arrive." Around the secondary screening area, the crowd of watching passengers continued to grow. News of the detention had spread through social media and word of mouth, drawing people from nearby gates who wanted to witness what many assumed was the arrest of a criminal attempting to flee the country. Phones recorded every moment from multiple angles, creating a digital record that would soon spread far beyond the airport. Patricia McMahon felt vindicated in her initial suspicions. 15 years of experience had taught her to trust her instincts about passengers who didn't belong, and federal confirmation of potential criminal activity proved her judgment correct. She stood straighter, her voice carrying new authority as she addressed Maria. "Ma'am, you are now detained pending a federal investigation.
You have the right to remain silent, and anything you say may be used against you in criminal proceedings. Do not attempt to leave this area or interfere with security operations. The Miranda-style warning marked a turning point in the confrontation. What had begun as document verification was now a federal detention. Around them, passengers whispered about what crimes the woman might have committed, what evidence the notebook might contain, what federal agencies were now involved in the investigation. Maria stood motionless at the metal table, her hands resting calmly at her sides. She could end this confrontation with a few words, could produce credentials that would immediately reverse the power dynamic and leave the security officers scrambling to apologize. But doing so would compromise her cover, potentially endanger other agents, and create exactly the kind of public exposure that federal operations were designed to avoid. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed across the terminal floor as federal agents made their way toward checkpoint Delta 7. The confrontation was about to escalate beyond airport security into something much more serious, something that would test not only Maria's patience, but her commitment to protecting operations that extended far beyond her personal comfort or convenience.
Kevin Hartwell straightened his uniform and prepared to brief the federal agents about the suspicious passenger they'd successfully detained. In his mind, this was exactly the kind of threat detection that justified the security procedures travelers often complained about. He had no idea that within minutes, his entire understanding of the situation would be turned completely upside down. Federal Agent Marcus Williams arrived at checkpoint Delta 7 within 8 minutes of the radio call. 29 years old, with 3 years of experience in airport federal liaisons, Marcus had responded to dozens of suspicious passenger situations. Most turned out to be misunderstandings or minor infractions, but his training demanded that he treat each case as potentially serious until proven otherwise. Behind him walked Agent Sarah Foster from the Denver Field Office of Homeland Security Investigations. Sarah specialized in document fraud and human trafficking cases, making her the logical choice when reports mentioned suspicious travel patterns and potential interstate criminal activity. Her presence signaled that federal authorities were taking this detention seriously. Maria watched their approach with a mixture of professional recognition and personal frustration. She could identify their agencies from their bearing, their positioning, and the way they scanned the area before focusing on the detained passenger. These were competent federal agents doing their jobs exactly as they'd been trained. The problem was that their training didn't account for situations where the suspected criminal was actually a federal agent operating under deep cover. Kevin Hartwell straightened his shoulders as the federal agents reached the secondary screening area. This was his first major detention since joining TSA, and having federal agents respond to his suspicious passenger report felt like validation of his diligence and training. He opened the notebook to the page with addresses spanning multiple states, ready to brief the agents on what he believed was evidence of criminal coordination. Agent Williams examined Maria's identification documents while Agent Foster studied the notebook contents. The handwritten entries showed patterns that could support multiple theories about the bearer's activities: phone numbers without names, addresses in high-crime neighborhoods, dates and times that suggested surveillance or coordination. Without context, the notebook painted a picture of someone deeply involved in activities that warranted federal investigation. A growing crowd of passengers had gathered at respectful distances around the secondary screening area. Word of the federal response had spread through the terminal, drawing people who wanted to witness what many assumed was the arrest of a dangerous criminal. Social media posts about the detention were beginning to circulate beyond the airport, attracting attention from local news outlets and federal oversight organizations. The teenage girl who had started the live stream now had over 3,000 viewers watching her phone screen. Comments poured in from people speculating about what crimes the detained woman might have committed, what federal agencies were involved, and whether this was connected to larger criminal investigations. The hashtag detained at Denver was beginning to trend on multiple platforms. Agent Foster flipped through several pages of the notebook, her training in document analysis revealing patterns that suggested systematic criminal activity. The geographical spread covered known trafficking corridors. The dates corresponded to periods when federal agencies had noted increased criminal activity in those regions. The phone numbers, when cross-referenced with federal databases, could potentially connect to ongoing investigations. Maria realized that every piece of evidence in her possession actually supported the case against her. 18 months of undercover work had required her to document criminal activities, maintain contact with suspects, and travel through exactly the regions where drug trafficking was most prevalent. Her dedication to building an airtight case had created what appeared to be perfect evidence of her own criminal involvement. Agent Williams looked up from the identification documents, his expression serious but professional. "Ma'am, we need to discuss some inconsistencies in your travel documentation and the contents of your personal belongings. The notebook contains information that suggests possible involvement in interstate criminal enterprises. Can you explain the purpose of these addresses and phone numbers?" The question offered Maria an opportunity to begin explaining her situation, but every truthful answer would require revealing classified information about ongoing federal operations. The addresses were surveillance locations, the phone numbers belonged to criminal suspects under investigation, the dates marked significant developments in cases that were still active and awaiting prosecution. Maria's voice remained calm despite the growing absurdity of her situation. "Those are work-related notes. I can't discuss the specifics without proper authorization from my supervisors." Kevin Hartwell leaned toward Agent Foster, his voice carrying excitement about his successful passenger identification. "She's been claiming government work, but look at her appearance and travel pattern. Nothing about her suggests legitimate federal employment. The expensive ticket was paid with a government card, but no supporting documentation or official credentials." Agent Foster examined Maria's driver's license again, noting the significant difference between the professional photograph and the woman's current appearance. Federal employees involved in legitimate government travel typically carried additional identification or authorization letters, especially when using government funding for expensive transportation. The absence of such documentation raised additional questions about the passenger's true identity and purpose. The live stream audience continued to grow as viewers shared the link across social media platforms. Comments speculated about everything from terrorism to drug trafficking to human trafficking cases. A local news station had dispatched a reporter to the airport after monitoring social media trends. The detention was evolving from a routine security matter into a public spectacle that would soon attract national attention. Patricia McMahon approached the group of federal agents carrying additional documentation she'd discovered while processing Maria's belongings. A credit card receipt from a gas station in El Paso 3 days earlier, a motel receipt from Phoenix the week before, and a handwritten note with what appeared to be surveillance times and locations. Each piece of evidence painted a clearer picture of someone moving through the Southwest in patterns consistent with criminal activity. Agent Williams studied the gas station receipt, noting that it was paid with cash and showed a purchase time of 2:30 in the morning. Combined with the motel stays in different cities and the notebook entries, it suggested someone who was either fleeing from law enforcement or coordinating with criminal networks across state lines. Maria watched the federal agents build a case against her using evidence she'd gathered while risking her life to infiltrate criminal organizations. Every receipt, every note, every documentation of her 18-month operation was being interpreted as proof of criminal activity rather than law enforcement dedication. The irony was so complete it would have been funny if her career and ongoing operations weren't hanging in the balance. A businessman recording the scene on his phone recognized Agent Foster from a news conference about human trafficking investigations 6 months earlier. His whispered commentary to his social media followers identified her as a specialist in interstate criminal enterprises, adding credibility to speculation that the detained woman was involved in serious federal crimes. Agent Foster closed the notebook and looked directly at Maria. The pattern of movement, the cash payments, the surveillance notes, and the identity discrepancies all suggest systematic criminal activity. We're going to need a full explanation of your activities over the past several months, including the source of funding for your travel and the purpose of your movements through known trafficking corridors. The formal tone marked a shift from preliminary questioning to serious federal investigation. Around them, passengers whispered about the escalating situation, while phones continued recording every interaction. The morning rush through security had effectively stopped as travelers gathered to witness what many believed was the capture of a significant criminal. Robert Chen coordinated with airport police to establish a perimeter around the secondary screening area. The growing crowd in social media attention required crowd control measures to maintain security operations. Additional TSA supervisors arrived to manage the curious passengers while ensuring that normal airport functions could continue despite the federal investigation. Maria's flight boarding announcement echoed through the terminal speakers. United Flight 1247 to Washington Reagan National would begin boarding premium passengers in 15 minutes. Missing the flight would trigger questions from federal prosecutors expecting her testimony, compromise arrest warrants that had been carefully timed, and potentially alert criminal suspects that their operations had been infiltrated. Agent Williams consulted his tablet computer, cross-referencing Maria's identification with federal databases. The results showed employment records with the Department of Justice, but the photograph and personal details didn't match the woman standing before them. Either the database entry was fraudulent or someone was using a federal employee's identity to facilitate criminal activities. The database search actually pulled up Maria's official federal employment record, but 18 months of undercover work had changed her appearance so dramatically that the professional headshot no longer resembled her current reality. Weight loss, hair changes, stress lines, and the general wear of extended field work had transformed her into someone who looked like she couldn't possibly be the same person as the polished federal agent in the government photograph. Robert Chen felt vindicated as the federal agents took his suspicious passenger report seriously. His training officer had emphasized the importance of trusting instincts about passengers who didn't belong, and this detention proved that vigilant security officers could identify serious threats that might otherwise slip through airport screening. The teenage girl's live stream viewer count approached 5,000 as news of the federal investigation spread across social media platforms. Local news outlets were beginning to pick up the story, describing it as a developing situation involving potential interstate criminal activity and federal law enforcement response at Denver International Airport. Agent Foster prepared to escort Maria to a federal interview room within the airport complex. The preliminary investigation had revealed enough inconsistencies and suspicious evidence to warrant formal questioning under federal authority. What had begun as a routine document verification was now a full federal investigation into suspected criminal enterprise and identity fraud. Maria stood calmly as the federal agents discussed her transport to the interview facility. She could end the entire situation with a single phone call to her supervisor, but doing so would potentially compromise operations that had taken 18 months to develop and could endanger other agents still working undercover in related investigations. The federal interview room at Denver International Airport was a sterile space designed for situations exactly like this. Gray walls, fluorescent lighting, a metal table with 4 chairs, and recording equipment that would document every word spoken during the investigation. Agent Sarah Foster activated the digital recorder, while Agent Marcus Williams arranged the evidence collected from Maria's belongings across the table surface. Airport Security Director Janet Morrison had been summoned from her office on the opposite side of the terminal complex. 22 years of federal law enforcement experience before joining TSA had taught her to recognize when routine security matters escalated into situations with potential media attention and legal ramifications. The social media buzz surrounding the detention meant that every decision made in the next hour would be scrutinized by thousands of people and potentially reviewed by congressional oversight committees.
Maria sat across from the federal agents, her hands folded calmly on the metal table. Behind her composure lay 18 months of training that had prepared her for interrogation scenarios, but always from the perspective of maintaining her cover while being questioned by criminals. Being interrogated by fellow federal agents who suspected her of crimes she'd risked her life to investigate created a psychological complexity that no training manual had addressed. Agent Foster spread out the gas station and motel receipts in chronological order, creating a timeline that showed movement through Phoenix, El Paso, San Antonio, and Denver over the past month. The pattern perfectly matched known trafficking routes and suggested someone either fleeing law enforcement or coordinating criminal activities across multiple jurisdictions. Without context about Maria's undercover investigation, the evidence painted a compelling picture of systematic criminal behavior. Director Morrison reviewed the preliminary case file that Agent Williams had prepared during the 20-minute transport to the interview room. The suspicious passenger had government identification that didn't match her appearance, carried surveillance notes covering known criminal corridors, paid for activities with cash to avoid electronic tracking, and purchased expensive government travel without proper authorization documentation. Every element suggested either elaborate identity theft or sophisticated criminal enterprise. The teenage girl's live stream had evolved into a news event that was attracting attention from major media outlets. Her viewer count had surpassed 8,000, and professional journalists were beginning to contact her for permission to use her footage in news reports. The hashtag detained at Denver was trending nationally, with speculation ranging from terrorism to drug cartels to human trafficking operations. A CNN breaking news alert appeared on phones throughout the terminal. Federal agents detained suspicious passenger at Denver Airport amid investigation into potential interstate criminal activity. Social media footage shows woman being questioned about surveillance materials and fraudulent government identification. Agent Foster began the formal interview process, her voice professional and measured. State your full name, date of birth, and current address for the record. Maria provided her real information, knowing that every detail could be verified through federal databases. The problem was that verification would show discrepancies between her official records and current circumstances that would only deepen suspicions about her true identity and activities.
Director Morrison watched the interview through a one-way observation window, taking notes that would become part of the official incident report. The detained passenger's demeanor was remarkably calm for someone facing potential federal charges. Most guilty parties either became agitated when confronted with evidence or attempted to deflect blame onto others. This woman seemed almost resigned to whatever consequences might follow. Agent Williams opened the notebook to a page containing phone numbers and meeting times for Maria's investigation in El Paso. Can you explain your relationship to these individuals and the purpose of these scheduled contacts? The phone numbers belonged to mid-level drug dealers who had trusted Maria with information about larger operations. The meeting times marked occasions when she'd gathered evidence about money laundering and trafficking coordination. But explaining any of that would require revealing details about ongoing federal investigations that were still gathering evidence for prosecution. Maria's response was careful and truthful within the constraints of operational security. Those contacts were part of work assignments that I'm not authorized to discuss without clearance from my supervisors. Agent Foster leaned forward, her expression skeptical. Work assignments that requires surveillance of known criminals, cash payments to avoid detection, and movement through trafficking corridors? That sounds more like criminal coordination than legitimate employment. The logic was impeccable from their perspective. Everything about Maria's documented activities over the past month suggested someone deeply involved in interstate criminal enterprises. Her calm demeanor could be interpreted as the confidence of someone who believed their criminal organization would protect them from federal prosecution. Outside the interview room, Terminal Security Chief David Park coordinated with the Denver Police Department to manage the growing media attention. Local news crews had arrived at the airport and were setting up cameras near the security checkpoint where the detention had occurred. The story was evolving from social media curiosity into a major news event that would require careful public relations management. United Flight 1247 to Washington Reagan National completed boarding and prepared for departure without Maria Santos. Her absence would trigger automatic notifications to federal prosecutors expecting her testimony in case proceedings scheduled for the following morning. The missed flight would create a cascade of rescheduled court appearances, delayed arrest warrants, and potential compromises to ongoing investigations. Agent Williams consulted his tablet to cross-reference the phone numbers from Maria's notebook with federal criminal databases. Several numbers appeared in connection with ongoing Drug Enforcement Administration investigations into Southwest trafficking networks. The matches strengthened the case that the detained passenger was involved in exactly the criminal activities that federal agencies were working to prosecute. The database hits were actually confirmations that Maria's undercover work had successfully identified key figures in the criminal network. But without access to classified DEA operational files, the airport federal agents interpreted the matches as evidence that she was communicating with known criminals rather than investigating them. Director Morrison received a phone call from her superior at TSA headquarters in Washington. The detention had attracted enough media attention to warrant notification of senior federal officials who would need to brief congressional oversight committees if the situation escalated further. Every decision made during the investigation would be reviewed by multiple federal agencies and potentially examined in public hearings. Agent Foster presented Maria with printed copies of her gas station and motel receipts. These show a pattern of cash payments and movement through areas known for drug trafficking activity. Combined with your communications with suspected criminals and your fraudulent government identification, we have probable cause to believe you're involved in interstate criminal enterprise. The accusation marked a turning point in the investigation. Probable cause meant that federal agents believed they had sufficient evidence to support criminal charges. Maria was no longer simply a suspicious passenger being questioned about travel documentation. She was now a suspect in a federal criminal investigation with potential charges that could include conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering. Social media coverage of the detention had attracted attention from criminal justice reform organizations and civil rights groups who began questioning whether the passenger was being targeted based on appearance rather than legitimate security concerns. The viral nature of the story meant that every aspect of the investigation would be scrutinized by advocacy groups, legal experts, and political commentators. A Fox News breaking news bulletin appeared on airport monitors throughout the terminal. Federal investigation underway at Denver Airport as agents question woman allegedly connected to interstate drug trafficking network. Exclusive social media footage shows detention and evidence of criminal activity. Agent Williams prepared to formally arrest Maria on charges of conspiracy to commit interstate drug trafficking, fraud, and identity theft. The evidence supported federal prosecution, and the media attention meant that failure to act decisively would be interpreted as law enforcement weakness in addressing serious criminal threats. Maria realized that the situation had reached a point where remaining silent would result in her arrest and potential compromise of ongoing operations that had taken 18 months to develop. Other agents were still undercover in related investigations, and her detention was already attracting the kind of media attention that could endanger their safety. Director Morrison entered the interview room to personally oversee the arrest procedure. High-profile cases require senior supervision to ensure that proper protocols were followed and that any subsequent legal challenges could be defended in court. Her presence signaled that the investigation had reached federal prosecution threshold. The recording equipment captured every word as Agent Foster began reading Miranda rights. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." Outside the interview room, media crews continued arriving at the airport while social media coverage spread across national platforms. The story had evolved from a routine security detention into a federal criminal investigation that was attracting attention from news outlets, political commentators, and law enforcement oversight organizations. Maria's hand moved slowly toward her jacket pocket, where credentials lay that could instantly reverse the entire situation. But using them would compromise ongoing operations, endanger other agents, and create exactly the kind of public exposure that federal undercover work was designed to avoid. The decision she made in the next few moments would determine whether justice prevailed or whether 18 months of dangerous work would be sacrificed to protect her personal freedom.
Maria's fingers closed around the leather credential case in her jacket pocket as Agent Foster finished reading the Miranda warning. The weight of the badge felt heavier than it ever had during 18 months of undercover work. Every federal agent understood that revealing their identity during active operations could compromise ongoing investigations, endanger fellow agents, and destroy months or years of careful work. But sitting in a federal interview room, being arrested by her own colleagues, had pushed the situation beyond normal operational parameters. Agent Williams reached for his handcuffs, preparing to formally arrest the woman they believed was a key figure in interstate drug trafficking operations. His training had taught him that suspects often made last-minute attempts to avoid arrest through false claims about law enforcement connections or government employment. The woman's calm demeanor and repeated references to work assignments could be elaborate deception designed to create reasonable doubt about her criminal activities. Director Morrison stood behind the federal agents, her 22 years of law enforcement experience focused on ensuring proper arrest procedures. The media attention surrounding this case meant that every protocol had to be followed precisely to avoid legal challenges that could undermine successful prosecutions. Her presence guaranteed that defense attorneys would have no procedural grounds for dismissing evidence or claiming rights violations. The live stream audience had grown to over 12,000 viewers as word of the imminent arrest spread across social media platforms. Comments flooded in from people speculating about what federal charges would be filed, what criminal organization the woman represented, and whether this was connected to larger investigations. The teenage girl recording the stream whispered excitedly about witnessing a major federal arrest in real time. Maria looked directly at Agent Foster, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. Before you proceed with this arrest, I need you to make a phone call. Call the Denver field office of the Drug Enforcement Administration and ask to speak with Special Agent in Charge, Rebecca Martinez. Tell her that Agent Maria Santos needs immediate operational support. The words hit the interview room like an explosion in a confined space. Agent Williams froze with his handcuffs halfway out of their case. Agent Foster's expression shifted from professional confidence to confusion and concern. Director Morrison stepped forward, her federal law enforcement experience telling her that legitimate agents didn't reveal their identity unless the situation had reached crisis levels. Agent Foster's voice carried skepticism mixed with uncertainty. "Ma'am, claiming to be a federal agent is a serious crime that carries additional penalties. If you're attempting to avoid arrest through false representation, you're only making your situation worse." Maria slowly withdrew her hand from her jacket pocket, the black leather credential case visible in her palm. "I'm not claiming to be a federal agent. I am a federal agent. DEA Special Agent Maria Santos, badge number 2847, assigned to Operation Desert Pipeline under the Southwest Regional Task Force." The revelation created a moment of absolute silence in the interview room. Agent Williams stared at the credential case as if it might be an explosive device. Agent Foster reached for her radio to verify the claim with federal databases. Director Morrison pulled out her phone to contact DEA headquarters directly. Outside the interview room, social media coverage was exploding with speculation about what was happening during the prolonged detention. The live stream comment section filled with theories about plea bargaining, confession negotiations, and potential cooperation agreements. No one watching the coverage could have imagined that the woman they'd watched being arrested was actually a federal agent whose undercover operation had been compromised by airport security procedures.
Maria opened the credential case with deliberate care, revealing the gold badge and identification card that marked her as a sworn federal law enforcement officer. The photograph matched her pre-undercover appearance, professional and polished in a way that contrasted sharply with her current disheveled state. But the badge number, holographic security features, and federal seals were unmistakably authentic. Agent Foster examined the credentials with growing alarm. The badge was real, the identity authentic, and the federal databases confirmed that DEA Special Agent Maria Santos was indeed assigned to Southwest Regional Task Force operations. But the woman holding the credentials looked nothing like the professional photograph, and her activities over the past month matched patterns of criminal behavior rather than law enforcement operations. Director Morrison's phone call to DEA headquarters triggered immediate alarm bells throughout the federal building. Special Agent in charge Rebecca Martinez had been expecting Maria's return from 18 months of deep undercover work, but not a call from airport security about her detention as a suspected criminal. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes before Martinez confirmed that one of her most valuable agents was being held on criminal charges at Denver International Airport. Agent Williams stepped back from the table, his understanding of the entire situation crumbling in real time. 18 months of evidence that had seemed to prove interstate criminal activity was actually documentation of one of the most successful undercover operations in DEA history. The surveillance notes, criminal contacts, and trafficking route movements were all part of an investigation that would result in the arrest of over 40 suspects and the seizure of millions of dollars in drugs and assets. The teenage girl's live stream experienced technical difficulties as federal authorities moved to contain the security breach. Revealing an active DEA agent's identity during ongoing operations violated multiple federal laws and could endanger other agents still working undercover. The viral nature of the coverage meant that damage control would require coordination between multiple agencies and potentially international law enforcement partners. Agent Foster terminated the recording equipment and immediately contacted Federal Communications Security to assess potential operational compromises. The media attention surrounding Maria's detention had created exactly the kind of public exposure that could alert criminal organizations to ongoing investigations and prompt them to destroy evidence or flee prosecution. Maria's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to commanding federal resources across multiple states. Operation Desert Pipeline has been active for 18 months, investigating drug trafficking networks from the Mexican border to Canadian distribution centers. Every piece of evidence you collected from my belongings represents months of dangerous undercover work that will result in prosecutions across 7 federal districts. Director Morrison felt the weight of federal oversight descending on her airport like an avalanche. The detention of an active DEA agent during ongoing operations would trigger investigations by the Department of Justice Inspector General, congressional oversight committees, and federal law enforcement review boards. Every decision made during the past 3 hours would be scrutinized by investigators looking for procedural failures and civil rights violations. Agent Williams realized that his careful evidence collection had actually documented one of the most successful federal investigations in recent history. The notebook entries that had seemed to prove criminal coordination were actually intelligence reports that would support prosecution of major trafficking organizations. The phone numbers belonged to suspects who had no idea they were providing evidence to a federal agent. The interview room door opened as Special Agent in charge Rebecca Martinez arrived at the airport with a full federal response team. 26 years of DEA experience had taught her to expect the unexpected. But having one of her agents detained as a criminal by fellow federal officers represented a new level of operational complexity that would require careful management to avoid compromising ongoing investigations. Martinez surveyed the interview room, taking in the evidence spread across the table and the shocked expressions of the airport federal agents. Agent Santos, report your operational status and assess potential security compromises from this incident. Maria stood as her supervisor entered, 18 months of undercover persona finally giving way to her real identity as a federal law enforcement officer. Ma'am, Operation Desert Pipeline remains secure. I maintained operational cover throughout the detention, but media attention may have compromised future undercover assignments. The power dynamics in the room had completely reversed. The woman who had been facing federal criminal charges was now the senior law enforcement officer present, with authority over investigations that extended across multiple states and involved federal resources worth millions of dollars. The airport security officers and federal agents who had arrested her were now scrambling to understand how their routine procedures had resulted in detaining one of their own colleagues. Agent Foster struggled to process the revelation that her careful investigation had been completely wrong from the beginning. Every piece of evidence that had seemed to prove criminal activity was actually proof of exceptional federal law enforcement work. The cash payments, surveillance activities, and criminal contacts were all part of an undercover operation that had successfully infiltrated organizations that other agencies had been unable to penetrate. Martinez addressed the airport security team with the authority of someone accustomed to managing complex federal operations. This incident will require immediate damage assessment and operational security review. Agent Santos's identity has been compromised through no fault of her own, but the media attention creates security risks that must be managed carefully. Outside the airport, news crews were beginning to realize that the story they'd been covering had taken an unexpected turn. Social media speculation about drug trafficking arrests was giving way to confusion about federal agents and operational security. The viral nature of the coverage meant that millions of people had witnessed what appeared to be a federal law enforcement failure of massive proportions. Maria looked at the agents who had spent the past 3 hours building a criminal case against her. The evidence you collected represents 18 months of work that will result in the dismantling of trafficking networks across the Southwest. Every receipt, every phone number, every surveillance note was gathered while risking my life to protect American communities from drug violence and addiction. The revelation transformed everything that had happened during the detention from a security success story into a cautionary tale about assumptions, prejudice, and the dangers of judging people based on appearance rather than evidence. The federal agents who had been preparing to arrest a major criminal were now facing the reality that they had detained a colleague whose work would save countless lives and remove dangerous criminals from American streets. Special Agent in Charge Rebecca Martinez closed her phone after a tense 15-minute conversation with DEA Administrator Thomas Chen in Washington. The detention of Agent Santos had triggered emergency protocols across multiple federal agencies, requiring immediate damage assessment and media containment strategies. Congressional oversight committees were already demanding briefings about how airport security procedures had compromised an active federal investigation. Kevin Hartwell stood in the airport administrative office, his young face pale as the magnitude of his mistake became clear. The suspicious passenger he'd been so proud to detain was actually a decorated federal agent whose undercover work had been instrumental in identifying major drug trafficking networks. His supervisor's words echoed in his mind. Sometimes being wrong about a passenger costs more than being right. Director Morrison faced her most serious professional crisis in 22 years of federal service. The Department of Homeland Security Inspector General had already opened an investigation into the incident, while TSA headquarters demanded a complete review of security protocols that had led to the detention of an active DEA agent. Her phone rang constantly with calls from federal oversight offices, congressional staff members, and media relations departments trying to manage the growing scandal. Agent Foster sat alone in a conference room, reviewing the case file that had seemed so compelling 3 hours earlier.
Every piece of evidence that had supported criminal charges was actually documentation of successful federal law enforcement work. The surveillance notes she'd interpreted as criminal coordination were intelligence reports that would support prosecutions across 7 states. Her career in federal investigations suddenly felt uncertain as supervisors questioned her judgment and decision-making process. The teenage girl who had live-streamed the detention found herself at the center of a media storm that extended far beyond her social media followers. News outlets were requesting interviews about her footage, while federal attorneys were examining whether her broadcast had compromised ongoing operations. The viral video that had seemed like entertainment was now evidence in multiple federal investigations. Martinez addressed the assembled airport officials and federal agents in the main conference room. Agent Santos successfully infiltrated criminal organizations that had eluded federal investigation for over a decade. Her work will result in the arrest of 43 suspects, the seizure of $12 million in assets, and the disruption of trafficking networks that supplied drugs to communities across the American Southwest. The scope of Maria's accomplishments transformed the detention from an embarrassing mistake into a catastrophic failure of institutional judgment. Federal prosecutors were preparing arrest warrants based on her intelligence gathering, while other agents remained undercover in related operations that could now be compromised by the media attention surrounding her blown cover. Robert Chen received a formal reprimand from TSA regional headquarters along with mandatory retraining on passenger profiling and discrimination prevention. His 15 years of experience hadn't prepared him for the possibility that a legitimate federal agent might travel under deep cover, appearing to be someone entirely different from their official identity. The incident would become a case study in training programs about assumptions and prejudicial judgment. Patricia McMahon faced suspension pending a full investigation of her role in escalating the situation. Her insistence that Maria didn't belong in business class, despite valid documentation, revealed patterns of bias that violated federal anti-discrimination policies. 15 years of what she'd considered successful security work was now being re-examined for evidence of systematic prejudice against passengers based on appearance rather than legitimate security concerns.
The social media coverage had created a public relations nightmare that extended beyond airport security into broader questions about federal law enforcement coordination and civil rights protection. Civil liberties organizations demanded investigations into racial profiling practices, while law enforcement associations defended the need for vigilant security procedures that sometimes resulted in honest mistakes. Agent Williams submitted his incident report knowing that every word would be scrutinized by federal investigators looking for procedural failures and civil rights violations. The case that had seemed like excellent police work was now being characterized as a systematic failure of federal coordination and communication. His 3 years of experience in airport federal liaison work suddenly felt inadequate for the complexity of modern law enforcement operations. Martinez reviewed the operational damage assessment that her intelligence analysts had prepared during the emergency response. Operation Desert Pipeline could continue with modified protocols, but Maria's blown cover meant that 18 months of relationship building with criminal suspects had been lost. Other agents working related cases would need enhanced security measures to prevent their identities from being compromised through association. The CNN breaking news update reflected the transformed narrative of the story. Federal agent detained by airport security in case of mistaken identity. DEA investigation compromised by security procedures. The coverage that had initially praised law enforcement vigilance was now questioning institutional competence and raising concerns about coordination between federal agencies. Maria completed her formal statement documenting the 18-month Operation Desert Pipeline investigation, knowing that every detail would be used to support prosecution of suspects who had trusted her with incriminating information. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same evidence airport security had used to build a criminal case against her would now be used to convict the actual criminals she'd spent over a year investigating. Director Morrison's phone conference with TSA Administrator Lisa Rodriguez lasted 45 minutes and covered every aspect of the detention from initial passenger screening through federal agent arrival. The administrator's questions focused on training deficiencies, protocol failures, and systemic issues that had allowed bias to override proper security procedures. The Fox News evening coverage included interviews with federal law enforcement experts who criticized the lack of coordination between airport security and federal agencies operating undercover investigations. Former DEA administrators described the incident as a breakdown in institutional communication that could have been prevented with better interagency protocols. Kevin Hartwell's written statement revealed the thought process that had led him to suspect Maria of criminal activity. His training had emphasized watching for passengers whose appearance didn't match their ticket class or travel patterns, but no one had prepared him for the possibility that legitimate federal agents might intentionally cultivate such mismatches as part of undercover operations. The Department of Justice announced a comprehensive review of airport security procedures affecting federal agents traveling under official or operational cover. Deputy Attorney General Sarah Wilson stated that new protocols would be developed to prevent future incidents while maintaining necessary security vigilance and operational security for ongoing investigations. Patricia McMahon's suspension included mandatory bias training and psychological evaluation to determine whether her actions reflected personal prejudice or systemic training failures. Her treatment of Maria had been recorded by multiple phones and would become evidence in civil rights investigations examining discriminatory practices in federal transportation security procedures. Martinez met privately with Maria to assess her psychological readiness to continue federal service after the traumatic experience of being detained and nearly arrested by fellow law enforcement officers. 18 months of undercover work, followed by detention as a suspected criminal, had created stress levels that required professional evaluation and possible extended recovery time. The operational security breach required notification of international law enforcement partners who had been coordinating with Operation Desert Pipeline. Mexican federal police, Canadian border authorities, and European drug enforcement agencies needed to assess whether their own investigations had been compromised by the media attention surrounding Maria's blown cover. Agent Foster faced a formal review board that would determine whether her actions during the investigation reflected poor judgment, inadequate training, or systemic failures in federal coordination protocols. Her interpretation of evidence was logical based on available information, but the consequences of being wrong about a fellow federal agent's identity were severe enough to warrant career-threatening disciplinary action. The teenage girl's viral video became evidence in congressional hearings about airport security effectiveness and federal agency coordination. Her live stream had inadvertently documented institutional failures that lawmakers used to question funding for security programs and oversight of federal law enforcement operations. Robert Chen's incident report included recommendations for enhanced training programs that would help security personnel recognize the possibility of legitimate undercover federal agents traveling under operational cover. The suggestions would become part of new TSA protocols designed to prevent future incidents while maintaining security vigilance and operational security for ongoing investigations. Martinez concluded her damage assessment with sobering statistics. Operation Desert Pipeline had cost $2.3 million and 18 months of dangerous undercover work. The airport detention had compromised ongoing prosecutions, endangered other agents, and created security vulnerabilities that would require months of additional investigation to resolve. The human cost of institutional bias had been measured in federal resources, criminal investigations, and public safety. The consequences extended far beyond individual careers into systemic questions about how federal agencies coordinated operations, how security personnel were trained to recognize legitimate authority, and how bias influenced decision-making in critical situations where mistakes could compromise national security investigations and endanger federal agents working to protect American communities. 3 years after the incident at Denver International Airport, the ripple effects of that morning's confrontation had transformed not just individual lives, but the entire landscape of federal law enforcement and transportation security. Maria Santos walked through the corridors of the newly constructed Federal Civil Rights and Security Training Institute in Quantico, Virginia. The facility, built with funding from congressional appropriations following the Denver incident, represented a fundamental shift in how America trained its security personnel. As the director of bias prevention and coordination training, Maria oversaw programs that reached over 15,000 federal employees annually, ensuring that the mistakes made at Denver would never be repeated. The Institute's main auditorium bore a bronze plaque that read, "In memory of institutional bias that once blinded us to the very people who protect us." The words served as a daily reminder to every trainee who passed through the program that assumptions based on appearance could have consequences far beyond personal embarrassment or career setbacks.
Maria's office walls displayed commendations and certificates that told the story of Operation Desert Pipeline's unprecedented success. The 18-month investigation she had conducted while living undercover had resulted in the complete dismantling of 7 major trafficking organizations, the arrest of 93 individuals across 12 states, and the seizure of assets worth over $47 million. Federal prosecutors achieved conviction rates of 96% in cases built on evidence she had gathered while risking her life to infiltrate criminal networks. But the numbers only told part of the story. The communities that had been plagued by drug violence, the families destroyed by addiction, and the children who grew up in neighborhoods controlled by criminal organizations had been freed from cycles of destruction that had persisted for decades. The woman who had been judged unworthy of a business class seat had actually been protecting millions of Americans from the devastating effects of organized drug trafficking. Kevin Hartwell, now 26 years old, served as lead training coordinator for the Transportation Security Administration's new Assumption Prevention Program. His transformation from a young officer who judged passengers by appearance to a nationally recognized expert in bias-free security screening had become a cornerstone of federal training curricula. His presentations, titled The Cost of Assumptions, were mandatory viewing for all new TSA employees and have been translated into 17 languages for international security organizations. Kevin's personal journey included therapy sessions with Dr. Amanda Richardson, a clinical psychologist specializing in unconscious bias recognition. Through months of intensive work, he had identified the underlying prejudices that had led him to assume Maria was a criminal based solely on her appearance. His willingness to confront his own biases publicly had made him an effective advocate for others struggling with similar issues. The young man who had once taken pride in his suspicious passenger detection rate now measured success differently. His new metrics focused on passenger satisfaction, civil rights protection, and the creation of security environments where every traveler felt respected, regardless of their appearance, background, or economic status. Kevin's department achieved the highest passenger approval ratings in TSA history while maintaining security effectiveness that exceeded previous standards. Patricia McMahon's journey back from suspension had been the most challenging of all the individuals involved in the incident. Her 15 years of what she'd considered successful security work had been revealed as systematic bias that violated the fundamental principles of equal treatment and civil rights. The psychological counseling required for her return to duty had forced her to confront prejudices she had never acknowledged possessing. Patricia now worked as a senior bias recognition specialist, traveling to airports across the country to conduct workshops for security personnel who struggled with unconscious discrimination. Her presentations included video footage of her interactions with Maria, used as training material to help others recognize how quickly assumptions could escalate into institutional failures.
The woman who had insisted Maria didn't belong in business class now dedicated her career to ensuring that every passenger was treated with dignity and respect. Her work extended beyond airports into broader civil rights education. Patricia had become a featured speaker at diversity conferences, law enforcement seminars, and academic symposia, where her transformation from biased security officer to civil rights advocate inspired others to examine their own prejudices. The painful process of acknowledging her mistakes had ultimately made her more effective at preventing others from making similar errors. Director Morrison's career had taken an unexpected turn following the comprehensive investigation of the Denver incident. Rather than ending her federal service, the crisis had elevated her to become the first director of the newly created Office of Federal Security Coordination. This cabinet-level position required her to oversee cooperation between all federal agencies operating personnel through transportation security systems. The system she now led employed over 200 specialists whose sole responsibility was preventing the kind of interagency communication failures that had led to Maria's detention. New protocols required real-time coordination between DEA, FBI, ATF, and other federal agencies when their personnel traveled under any type of operational cover. The systems Morrison developed had prevented over 40 potential incidents in their first 3 years of operation. Her transformation from airport security director to federal coordination chief had required mastery of complex legal frameworks, international cooperation agreements, and technological systems that connected law enforcement agencies across multiple countries. The woman who had once managed a single airport now influenced security policies that affected millions of travelers and thousands of federal agents worldwide. Agent Foster's experience analyzing evidence that had seemed to prove Maria's guilt had fundamentally changed her approach to federal investigation. Her new role as Chief of Evidence Analysis for the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division required her to review cases where law enforcement decisions might have been influenced by bias rather than objective evidence examination. The skills that had made her effective at building criminal cases were now applied to protecting citizens from discriminatory treatment by government agencies. Her team reviewed over 3,000 cases annually, identifying patterns of bias that might otherwise go undetected. Her expertise in recognizing how assumptions could influence evidence interpretation had made her invaluable in creating systems that protected both security and civil rights. Her work included developing artificial intelligence systems that could identify potential bias in federal investigations before cases reached prosecution stages. The algorithms she helped design analyzed thousands of data points to flag investigations where officer assumptions might be influencing evidence interpretation. These systems had already prevented dozens of cases where bias could have led to wrongful prosecutions or civil rights violations. The young girl whose live stream had documented the entire incident transformed her social media presence into a platform for civil rights education and bias awareness. Now 21 years old and studying law at Georgetown University, she used her experience witnessing institutional discrimination to advocate for transparency and accountability in government operations. Her documentary about the Denver incident, produced during her junior year, had won national awards and is now used in law schools across the country to teach students about the real-world consequences of bias in legal systems. The film included interviews with every person involved in the incident, creating a comprehensive examination of how assumptions had nearly destroyed a federal investigation and endangered public safety. Her advocacy work extended beyond social media into legislative lobbying and policy development. She had testified before congressional committees about the need for enhanced civil rights protection in federal law enforcement, drawing on her unique perspective as someone who had witnessed bias in action and documented its consequences in real time. Special Agent in Charge Martinez had been promoted to Associate Deputy Administrator of the DEA, making her one of the highest-ranking female officials in federal law enforcement. Her handling of the crisis at Denver had demonstrated leadership capabilities that transformed her from a regional supervisor into a national figure in law enforcement reform.
The operational security improvements she had developed following the incident were now used by law enforcement agencies in 43 countries. Her protocols for protecting undercover agents while maintaining necessary security vigilance had prevented the kind of institutional failures that had compromised Maria's operation. International law enforcement organizations regularly consulted her expertise when developing their own coordination systems.
Martinez's influence extended beyond operational security into broader questions of diversity, inclusion, and bias prevention in federal agencies. She had established mentorship programs that helped agents from minority backgrounds navigate challenges similar to those Maria had faced. These programs had increased retention rates among diverse agents and improved the effectiveness of operations requiring cultural sensitivity and community trust. The congressional legislation that emerged from the Denver incident had created permanent changes in how federal agencies coordinated their operations. The Federal Transportation Security Coordination Act required enhanced communication systems, bias protection training, and civil rights protection measures that influenced every aspect of government security operations. The law established the Federal Civil Rights in Security Office, with authority to investigate complaints about discriminatory treatment in any federal security context. This office had processed over 12,000 complaints in its first 3 years, resulting in policy changes, personnel actions, and compensation for individuals who had experienced discrimination from federal agencies. Robert Chen's development of enhanced supervisor training programs had created a new generation of security leadership that prioritized verification over assumption and communication over isolation. His curricula were now used by security organizations in 27 countries, spreading the lessons learned from Denver to international partners who faced similar challenges in balancing security needs with civil rights protection. The transformation in airport security culture was visible to any traveler who had experienced both pre- and post-Denver procedures. Security personnel now approached their work with enhanced awareness of how bias could influence their decisions, while new protocols ensured that every passenger received respectful treatment regardless of their appearance or background. The operational successes that had emerged from Maria's undercover work continued to produce benefits 3 years after her detention. The criminal networks she had infiltrated remained completely dismantled, with no evidence of reorganization or recovery. The intelligence she had gathered continued to support investigations in related cases, demonstrating the long-term value of the work that had nearly been compromised by institutional bias. Drug seizure rates in the Southwest had decreased by 43% since the completion of Operation Desert Pipeline, indicating that the trafficking networks Maria had documented had been unable to rebuild their operations. Communities that had been plagued by drug violence reported significant improvements in safety, economic development, and quality of life for families who had been trapped in cycles of criminal exploitation. Federal prosecutors had used evidence from Maria's investigation to support asset forfeiture actions that redirected over $32 million from criminal organizations to community development programs. These funds supported drug treatment centers, educational initiatives, and job training programs in the neighborhoods that had been most damaged by trafficking operations. The international cooperation that had been temporarily disrupted by the incident had been restored with enhanced protocols that protected undercover operations while maintaining necessary collaboration between agencies. Mexican federal police, Canadian border authorities, and European drug enforcement agencies had developed new procedures based on lessons learned from the Denver incident. 3 years after nearly being arrested as a drug trafficker, Maria concluded her presentations at the Federal Civil Rights and Security Training Institute with words that had become a fundamental principle of modern law enforcement. Every person who walks through your checkpoint, every individual you encounter in your official capacity deserves to be treated with the same respect you would want for yourself, your family, or your colleagues. The badge we wear represents not just authority, but responsibility to protect the rights and dignity of every person we serve. The transformation that followed the Denver airport incident had exceeded every expectation for institutional change and civil rights protection. Individual careers had been rebuilt, federal policies had been reformed, and American security operations had been fundamentally improved. But the most important change was in the daily interactions between security personnel and the public they served. Airport security checkpoints across America now display digital monitors with rotating messages that reminded personnel of the principles learned from that morning in Denver. Respect through verification. Dignity for all. Communication prevents discrimination. Service above assumption. The incident that had once threatened to destroy a federal investigation had become the foundation for reforms that protected both security and civil rights. The teenage girl's viral video, which had originally documented what viewers thought was the arrest of a criminal, was now preserved in the National Archives as a historical record of how quickly truth could replace assumption, how dramatically situations could change when bias gave way to facts, and how important it was to reserve judgment until all evidence was examined. Maria Santos, the woman who had been detained for appearing to not belong in business class, had transformed that experience into a career dedicated to ensuring that no federal agent would ever again face institutional bias from colleagues sworn to the same principles of justice. Her 18 months of dangerous undercover work had dismantled criminal networks and saved countless lives. But her 3 hours of detention had ultimately saved an entire system from the blindness of its own prejudices. The morning rush at Denver International Airport continued as it always had, with travelers hurrying toward gates and security personnel processing thousands of passengers daily. But the procedures that guided those interactions had been fundamentally transformed by the understanding that respect, verification, and communication were not just policies to follow, but principles that protected everyone who believed in justice, equality, and the fundamental dignity that every person deserved, regardless of their appearance, background, or the assumptions others might make about who they seemed to be.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.